I remember the carpet in our living room, rough under my knees, while the TV flickered blue light across my face like a cold night. I was 6, maybe 7, holding a broken toy truck in my hands, trying to decide if the crack in it was my fault. My father sat in his chair, newspaper open, coffee cooling beside him, and my mother moved quietly in the kitchen like a ghost. I didn't cry loudly, not because I was brave, but because I already knew what crying did in that house. It didn't bring comfort. It didn't bring arms around my shoulders. It only brought silence that felt heavier than punishment. So I swallowed the lump in my throat, stared at the broken toy, and practiced the skill that would follow me into adulthood. I practiced pretending I was fine. Years later, I would sit in a therapist's office, staring at a box of tissues, and realize I couldn't name a single emotion inside me. The therapist would ask, "What are you feeling right now?" And my mind would go blank, like an unplugged radio. I could tell you what I thought, what I planned, what I needed to do tomorrow. But feelings were a foreign language I never learned. I would say, "I don't know," and laugh softly, as if that was normal, as if it didn't terrify me to my core. Outside that office, my life looked functional, respectable, even successful, but inside, everything felt strangely muted. Joy came like a distant sound through a closed door, and sadness came like pressure behind my eyes that never turned into tears. Excitement felt suspicious, like it might explode into disappointment if I trusted it too much. And anger, when it showed up, didn't arrive as words. It arrived as headaches, clenched jaws, and nights I couldn't sleep. I didn't understand it then, but I was living with emotions I never got to meet. It was like carrying a storm in my chest without ever being taught what rain was. Back in that childhood living room, my parents weren't cruel in obvious ways, but they were absent in the places that mattered most. No one asked me how my day was. No one knelt down to meet my eyes. No one said, "Tell me what's wrong." And slowly, without anyone noticing, I learned the most dangerous lesson a child can learn. My feelings were not welcome here. By middle school, I had mastered the art of being low maintenance, the kind of kid teachers called easy because I never needed anything. I learned to smile automatically, to nod at jokes I didn't understand, and to swallow disappointment like it was just part of breathing. At home, emotions were treated like messes, and messes were not allowed, so I kept my inner world folded up like a secret letter. But what no one tells you is that neglected emotions don't disappear. They just hide, waiting for a moment to surface later. The first time I noticed it, I was in my 20s, standing in a grocery store, and a stranger asked, "What are you doing?" It was harmless, casual, nothing more than curiosity, but my body reacted like I'd been caught stealing. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped, and my voice snapped back sharper than I intended, as if I was defending my right to exist. I watched the stranger's face change, confused, and I felt shame rush through me like hot water. I wanted to explain, to say, "I'm sorry, I'm not angry at you," but the words wouldn't come out right. Instead, I did what I always did. I retreated behind politeness and pretended I wasn't rattled. That's the thing about emotional neglect. It trains your nervous system to treat normal questions like threats. It teaches you that being noticed is dangerous, because attention used to mean criticism, dismissal, or cold silence. And when you grow up in that kind of quiet, you don't develop emotional skin, you develop emotional armor. You walk through life bracing for impact, even in moments that are supposed to be gentle. Friends would ask, "Are you okay?" And I would feel my body stiffen, like the question itself was a trap. Because as a child, "Are you okay?" was never followed by comfort. It was followed by annoyance, or worse, nothing at all. So I became defensive without meaning to, reacting to the past while standing in the present. And I didn't even know I was doing it, because my reactions felt normal, like instinct, like survival. In my head, I wasn't angry. I was just protecting myself from something I couldn't name. But deep down, the child on that rough carpet was still there, still waiting for someone to kneel down and ask gently, "What happened?" In adulthood, that defensiveness didn't stay in grocery aisles. It followed me into conversations, marriages, friendships, even the way I answered the phone. Someone would say, "Hey, what's going on?" And my brain would translate it into, "What did you do wrong this time?" So I started managing people before they could manage me, smoothing every edge, predicting moods, trying to stay one step ahead. I became the person who remembered birthdays, checked in first, brought extra food, offered help before anyone even asked. People called me thoughtful, generous, dependable, and I smiled like I was proud. But inside it felt like a job I couldn't quit. Because the truth was, I didn't relax unless everyone else was okay. At dinner tables, I watched faces more than I tasted food, scanning for irritation the way a soldier scans for movement. If someone sighed, my stomach tightened, and I would rush to fix it, change the subject, refill a glass, make myself useful. That's what people-pleasing looks like from the outside: a polite person, a peacemaker, someone who doesn't like conflict. But from the inside, it's panic dressed up as kindness. It's the nervous system saying, if they're upset, you are not safe, even when you're sitting in a perfectly normal room. I remember one night, my partner came home quiet, just tired, and I instantly felt like I'd done something unforgivable. I asked, "Are you mad?" Then, "Did I do something?" Then, "Are we okay?" Until my voice sounded desperate, even to me. My partner blinked, confused, and said, "No, I'm just exhausted," and I nodded, pretending I understood. But my body didn't believe them, because my body still lived in that childhood house where silence meant rejection. And here's the part nobody talks about. People-pleasing isn't always love. It's often a survival strategy that got stuck on repeat. It's what happens when a child learns that emotional connection must be earned, not given freely. So we grow into adults who perform for affection, who shapeshift into whatever makes others comfortable, hoping comfort will finally return to us. And we don't even realize we're doing it because it feels like responsibility, like being the strong one, like being the adult in the room. But late at night, when the house is quiet, the same quiet as that old living room, the exhaustion hits like a wave and you wonder why you feel so alone. The exhaustion didn't just come from pleasing others, it came from never asking for anything in return. I was the friend who helped people move, the coworker who stayed late, the sibling who handled the paperwork no one wanted. But when I needed help carrying something heavy, I would rather drop it than say, "Can you grab the other side?" There was a strange pride in doing everything alone, like independence was proof that I was not a burden. I told myself I was strong, self-sufficient, resilient, words that sounded admirable but felt isolating. Underneath that, pride was an old belief that my needs were inconvenient, maybe even unacceptable. As a child, asking for comfort felt like asking for too much, like adding weight to people who were already distant. So, as an adult, even when I was drowning, I smiled and said, "I've got it." I remember carrying a couch up a narrow staircase with a friend, both of us straining, and I refused to admit my hands were slipping. It would have taken one sentence to say I needed a break, but the words stuck in my throat like they always had. And when we finally set it down, my arms shaking, I laughed it off as if pain was just part of the deal. That same pattern followed me into work, into relationships, into every corner of my life. If I made a mistake, even a small one, shame hit me fast and hard, like a door slamming shut. A typo in an email could ruin my entire day, because in my body, mistakes meant something much bigger. They meant withdrawal, coldness, the possibility of being unloved. So I covered my tracks, double-checked everything, rehearsed conversations in my head before they happened. On the outside, I looked meticulous and driven. On the inside, I was terrified of being found out. I developed what I now call toxic independence, the kind that says, "I don't need anyone," but secretly aches for someone to notice. It was safer to be alone than to risk being seen as too emotional, too needy, too much. Just like that child on the carpet, holding a broken toy and deciding that the crack must have been my fault, the loneliness didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly, like dust gathering in corners no one thought to check. I began declining invitations, telling friends I was tired, busy, swamped, when really, I just felt safer behind closed doors. In solitude, no one could ask how I was doing, and I wouldn't have to search for answers I still didn't know. My bed became a refuge, the covers pulled high like armor, the room dim and predictable. Out there, in conversation, I felt exposed, like someone might accidentally brush against something fragile inside me. So isolation felt practical, even responsible, like minimizing risk. But human beings aren't wired for long-term isolation, especially not the kind born from fear. The more I withdrew, the more distant I felt from the world, and the more convinced I became that distance was normal. And then there were the lies. Small at first, harmless on the surface. I'm fine. I'm just busy. No, nothing's wrong. Sometimes I lied about where I was going, or what I thought, or whether something hurt. Not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because truth had never felt safe growing up. As a child, honesty about feelings was often met with dismissal, or worse, silence. So I learned to protect my inner world by keeping it hidden, like locking valuables in a drawer. Over time, that habit followed me into adulthood, even when there was no real danger present. Relationships became complicated, not because I didn't care, but because parts of me stayed behind closed doors. And here's the part nobody talks about. Compulsive lying can feel like self-protection, not manipulation. It can feel like safeguarding something tender that once got trampled. But every time I withheld the truth, a small gap formed between me and the people who loved me. And in that growing gap, the echo of that quiet living room returned, the child still waiting to be understood. Decision-making became another quiet battlefield, because when you don't know what you feel, you don't know what you want. A restaurant menu could take me 20 minutes, not because I cared about food, but because choosing felt like stepping onto thin ice. I'd ask, "What are you getting?" and build my answer around theirs, as if my own preference didn't have the right to exist. Sometimes, I froze completely, staring at options until the waiter returned, and I panicked, picking something random just to escape. It wasn't about dinner. It was about the fear of being wrong, the fear of disappointing someone, the fear of being punished for having a need. And then came the hardest pattern to admit, the one that hurt the most when I finally saw it clearly. I kept choosing emotionally unavailable partners, the kind who felt familiar because they felt like home. They were distant, distracted, half-present, and I called it independent because the truth sounded too painful. When they pulled away, I chased harder, believing love was something you earned by proving you could survive without it. But when someone kind showed up, someone emotionally open, someone who actually wanted to know me, I felt uncomfortable. Their warmth felt suspicious, like a spotlight shining directly on the parts of me I'd kept hidden my entire life. I mistook stability for boredom, intimacy for clinginess, and consistent affection for something that couldn't possibly be real. Because my nervous system had been trained in childhood that love comes with distance, and closeness comes with risk. That's what emotional neglect does. It rewires what feels normal, until healthy connection feels foreign, and unavailable connection feels safe. And here's the part nobody talks about. You don't choose these patterns because you're broken. You choose them because they once kept you alive. The child in that living room didn't have the luxury of learning emotions. They had the job of surviving silence. But then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just one small moment that cracked the whole story open. I watched my own child cry one day, their face red, their breath shaky, and my body wanted to do what my parents did. To look away, to tell them to stop, to push it down, because emotions still scared me. And instead, I knelt down on the floor, the same way I once knelt on that rough carpet, and I whispered, "Tell me what you feel."